Now, we're still talking about the explosion at the Kakhovka Dam, and we're going to look at experts on both sides saying who did it. I'm going to give you really strong voices on either side. Now, I have a clear opinion on this, but I want you to hear what they have to say, and then we'll work our way through stuff. New York Times yesterday said deliberate explosion inside Ukraine dam most likely caused the collapse. So that leads us to who has control inside the dam, which seems to point to Russia. But we're not going to stop there. I'm going to let you hear videos from four people. Medhurst, Scott Ritter on the Russia is innocent and Ukraine did it side. And we'll also hear Operator Starsky, and we'll start with Peter Zeihan. So let's hear what Peter has to say first.
Yesterday, I released a video, or I guess it would be this morning, released a video on why the Russians blew up the Kakhovka Dam. And people came out of the woodwork to say I didn't know what I was talking about, and obviously it was the Ukrainians. Just to give you a quick refresh, two things. Number one, the Ukrainians are starting their counteroffensive. And by blowing up the dam, what the Russians have done is they've made a direct crossing at the dam impossible, obviously, but they've also made an amphibious landing on either side of the dam on the river impossible, because the reservoir above the river is now draining very, very quickly. And independent of that being a dangerous environment, it's going to leave behind a muddy bed, which is going to be very difficult to get any vehicles across. And then south of the river, everything is flooded. And when the waters do recede a couple weeks from now, again, very, very muddy and difficult to move. So any sort of
Okay, remember this point, what he just talked about how it makes both sides inoperable when you get to Scott Ritter, because Scott Ritter's going to make it sound like they were doing it for the sake of, see how much easier it is to cross. Just listen.
Landing is going to be impossible. In addition, most of the thrust probably is going to be south from Zaporizhzhia towards the Sea of Azov. And in that sort of scenario, Russian forces are going to have a choice of going one or two directions. They can go east to the Donbass and get back to Mother Russia, or they can go southwest and cross over into the Crimean Peninsula. If the Ukrainians had been able to capture the Kakhovka Dam rather than have it destroyed, they had the chance of actually cutting those forces off. And then you might have tens of thousands of encircled Russian troops that would have to surrender. And the global hit to Russian power from that would have been immense. That is now completely off the table. So from a purely military perspective, the Russians made a wise move. There's also a long-term economic issue. 1,000,000 acres of southern Ukraine is no longer getting irrigation water because it came from that reservoir. Water levels now drop below the levels of the canals, so they're dry. Aside from a few pockets of dry wheat, that's it. So you've just taken the single largest chunk of agricultural land in history offline all at once.
So I read yesterday that something like 80% of the agriculture in the region, which is, I mean, this is the breadbasket of the breadbasket, right? 80% of that was watered with from the reservoir or the river or the tributaries. So it's going to drastically diminish Ukraine's ability to produce food.
Yikes. Anyway, back to the dam. This might seem kind of simple, but dams are giant pieces of reinforced concrete that are hundreds of feet thick at the base. This thing's 1,500 feet from one side to the other. It's at least 200 feet thick, probably thicker. Soviets didn't keep good data on that for the rest of us. And you don't just throw a few bombs at this. If you want to take out the dam from the air, you attack the weak points. Those are specifically the control gates and the navigation locks that you have on both sides, up and below. That's not what was hit. If the navigation locks were hit, that would be where the water is flowing through. They're high and dry now. And if the control gates were hit, that wouldn't have necessarily led to a structural failure across the entire length of the dam, which is exactly what we're seeing. No, this thing was blown up from the inside, specifically with tons of explosives, specifically located in the turbine room.
And that's what you just saw with the New York Times, that it had to be from the inside. And who controls it? The Russians.
Ukrainians to have done that, they would have had to have launched an attack on the dam. Somehow the Russians, who had been preparing for this for a year, didn't notice, and then managed to smuggle like 2 cargo trucks worth of explosives and place them and hit the trigger. No. You're also not going to do this with 500-pound bombs, or at least not 1 or 2. So, the other aircraft idea is like a direct attack on the dam. Well, I mean, number one, that requires aircraft. and there was no indication of aircraft or anti-aircraft fire in this area that night. And you're not going to do it with one plane, you're going to do it with several, because it takes a lot to crack one of these suckers open. And then third, Ukrainians don't have fighter bombers. I mean, they inherited a few from the Soviet Union. They had at the beginning of the war. They haven't been flying in them because they're not any good in the dogfight role. And they don't have the bombs that would be necessary anyway. So you're talking about, what, multiple dumb drops with weapons that they don't have from platforms that they really don't fly? I'm sorry. The people who say that this was Ukraine are just headless at this point.
Anyway. Okay, so that's it from Peter Zeihan. Let's look at Operator Starsky. You'll get to see some visuals from Starsky, as well as how he says that the Russians are going to frame this. So this is worth listening to.
Yesterday, the flooding caused by the Russian terrorist act in Kakhovka reached its peak and will be decreasing in the upcoming 3 days. People all around Ukraine collect clothes and other aid for the victims of the Russian ecocide. Thousands of civilian houses were lost because of the terrifying destruction of the dam caused by the Russian terrorists, who planted mines in the dam last year and threatened multiple times to set it off. Situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is stable, according to the IAEA. However, the water in the reservoir decreased by almost 3 meters. Realizing how much they screwed up with committing the biggest ecocide in Europe in the past 20 years, the Russians instantly activated all kinds of the informational influencers, copy-pasting 3 main narratives. The UN destroyed the Nord Stream, even though several Russian ships were reported in the area days before the explosion, according to the Danish Coast Guard. Ukraine destroyed the dam because it...
and sometimes they'll say that it was Ukraine that did it, or US that did it, or NATO that did it. There's variations of that.
Benefits Ukraine's counteroffensive, obviously by creating thousands of additional internal refugees and making the river harder to cross for the advancing troops. And the Russian invaders, who absolutely love nature and respect the rules of war and already blew up a dam in November 2022, would never do such a horrible crime against nature in a foreign country they want to destroy. Just to remind you, last year the Russians even gathered a UN Security Council meeting to bullshit about the biolabs. Also, I received several comments mentioning the dam that was destroyed last year north of Kiev to stop the Russian tanks from crossing the Irpin River. Just for comparison, this is me crossing the extremely flooded Irpin River, and this is the Dnipro River after the Russian...
There's no contest between the two. One stopped tanks from crossing a river. This flooded 80 settlements. There's a huge difference. Okay, let's hear Scott Ritter talk about his perspective on this.
It's an interesting question, which is, who done it? The United States, Europe, NATO, and the Ukrainians are all pointing the finger at Russia. Well, Russia says it wasn't us, it was the Ukrainians.
And you can believe them, because the Russians never lie, do they?
I mean, if you're going to buy into the notion that Russia destroyed this dam, then you have to accept the fact that Russia sought to dismantle much of the defensive systems that they had put in place to defend the Kherson region from a potential Ukrainian counterattack, to include minefields, entrenchments, etc., that Russia would deliberately create the conditions that would promote the potential of a Ukrainian counteroffensive north of the dam as the reservoir drains, making it easier for Ukrainian troops to pass. You would also
so now you just heard Peter Zeihan say exactly the opposite, that both flooding and the draining were going to create muddy conditions or inoperable conditions on either side. So that's kind of neutralized.
To accept the concept that Russia is in the business of attacking Russia. Now, if you're the United States, NATO, Europe, you've already bought into that narrative. After all, it was the Russians who attacked the Crimea Bridge. It was the Russians.
Wait, who's saying that the Russians attacked that? No one that I know of in the pro-Ukraine YouTube kind of space was saying anything like that, that it was Russia doing false flag on the Kerch.
Who blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Now that's an open question, and we'll talk about that in just a moment.
Russians that launched drone strikes against the Kremlin. It's the Russians that continue to shell innocent civilians in Donetsk.
But in the rest of the country, innocent civilians are being shelled by Russians, and it's pretty obvious.
Ukraine did it. How do we know? Well, one, Russia's been warning us about this potential since October of last year, when they published a letter to the Security Council of the United Nations saying that Ukraine is preparing to attack this dam and warning the world of the potential catastrophic consequences of such an attack. We also know because a Ukrainian general bragged about how they put in place a plan to destroy the dam, and they actually tested it out by firing HIMARS rockets at the dam, confirming that A, they could strike the dam, and B, they could inflict the damage necessary to achieve the destruction of the dam. Let's not fool ourselves any longer. Ukraine attacked the Kakhovka Dam. Ukraine is a terrorist organization. Ukraine is a terrorist nation. It's high time the world.
Okay, let's just take what he just said. Whoever attacked the dam is a terrorist nation. We can agree on that. But I don't know that it was Ukraine. In fact, I'm pretty certain that it wasn't. Let's go on and look at Richard Medhurst. Richard Medhurst has quite a following here as well, and he's going to talk about who attacked the dam.
So you have another terrorist attack in Ukraine. This time it's the Kakhovka Dam. And the first thing the media do is blame the Russians.
Well,
so let's see why the Russians would do it. They control the dam.
Mm-hmm.
They control the region.
Yeah.
They need the dam to funnel water to Crimea, which is also under Russian control. They literally have zero motive. There is no motive.
They have plenty of motive to attack that dam, and that includes creating a huge headache where now the Ukrainians have to deal with the aftermath of the dam instead of focus on the counteroffensive. That includes retribution. That includes a natural disaster that will take maybe decades to sort out on the other side. They have plenty of motive.
You know, the Washington Post in December published an article showing how Ukraine targeted this dam.
Okay, so this is the problem when you don't actually read. If you can read and you don't read, you're no better off. So see what he's highlighted here? Kakhovka considered flooding the river. The Ukrainians, he said, even conducted a test strike with HIMARS launcher on one of the floodgates at the Kakhovka Dam. Now the rest of it says, making 3 holes in the metal to see if the Dnieper's water could be raised enough to stymie Russian crossings, but not flood nearby villages. The test was a success, Kakhovka said, but the step remained a last resort. He held off. So that's a different perspective than that they tried to destroy the entire dam.
Using American missiles, using the HIMARS system. They actually fired a missile at this dam. To test if they could flood areas. Sound familiar? This is the same thing.
Yeah, but you're making it sound like they were trying to destroy the dam. They were trying to see if they could, without destroying the dam, be able to use it to defend themselves. That's very, very different.
We saw with the Nord Stream pipeline attacks, right? The first thing the press do is let's go and blame Russia. And now, almost a year later, the Washington Post finally admits that Ukraine, not Russia, Ukraine blew up the Nord Stream pipeline.
Well, that's not exactly it either, because you really just don't spend time reading the whole article. And I did read the article. So the U.S. had intelligence that Ukraine wanted to do something like that. They were talking about doing something like that. They even had some plan to try to do something like that. But, and I'm quoting, the CIA initially questioned the credibility of the information, in part because the source in Ukraine who provided the details had not yet established a track record of producing reliable information, according to officials familiar with the matter. The European service, a trusted U.S. partner, felt the source was reliable, so they didn't know. Then it was a different attack. It attacked different things than what the original data said, and we still don't know what it is. So we have intelligence of some plan to perhaps do this. We don't know that they did. We are not certain even still, although it is possible that they could have done it. So you say it as if it was done deal. It was very clear. We don't know yet. But again, you're saying this, saying more than what you can actually say based on the article that you're showing on the screen, which makes you pretty suspect.
This is something that I, myself, and others have been saying since the very beginning.
I believe that.
Anyone with half a brain knew that it was not Russia. Russia would not blow up their own pipeline.
And if you have a full brain, you wait for all the facts to come in before you make assertions like this.
But, you know, this was dismissed as a crackpot conspiracy theory that NATO would maybe do this or Ukraine. No, that's Russian propaganda. And another example...
that NATO would do this. So would NATO risk World War III over that? Probably not. So we'll take NATO off the table. Could have been Ukraine. We don't know. But the point is that we don't know. But what we do know is that we have to try to add up the facts and look in both sides and see what adds up and what doesn't, and try to get away from our own inclinations. Like my inclination is to say, see, Russia did that. So now what I have to do, and Medhurst's inclination is to say, see, Ukraine did it. So what we both need to do is try to test the other theories, and that's why we need to listen to the other side, hear what they have to say, and be able to understand what is most likely to have happened. So bring this back full circle. We don't necessarily know, but the evidence, from my estimation, seems to stack up a particular direction. And that direction is that it's internal, it has to go through massive amounts of concrete. Wasn't missile strike, there's no evidence of that. Wasn't bombed, there's no evidence of that. And if that's the case, where does it lie? Okay, that's all that I have here. Tonight, or a little bit later on today, I'm going to release a video of Tucker Carlson talking about, well, the same thing in his first episode on his Twitter channel. So he's talking about, he spent 3/4 of that entire episode talking about this episode in Ukraine. And you don't want to miss that. I'll talk to you very shortly. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares enough to be listening to me now. Thank you for the likes. Thank you for the subscribes. Thank you for the shares, the coffees. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.